I'm Kevin with Springfield Leather. You know, one of the most difficult things that people have trouble with when they're trying to do Western floral carving is decorative cuts. And decorative cuts, they're just the hardest part of it. So I thought I'd take a few minutes today and show you just a couple of tricks that will really help you a lot if you're having a little trouble with your decorative cuts. Okay, first of all, leather, water. Believe it or not, when you're making decorative cuts, usually at that time you've got your pattern pretty well tooled, but you still have to have the right amount of water in the leather for your knife to be able to work happily. Now, I got a nice piece of Herman oak leather here and I'm getting it pretty darn wet. And if I'm going to be doing Western floral style carving on leather, I really want it to be Herman oak. I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I've been carving leather for a lot of years and I know the difference between a good carving leather and a carving leather that's not so good, so that's why I like to use this. Now, as you can see, after the leather was wet, and it was wet pretty good, it's starting to return to its natural color. That's what I want. It's ready to make those cuts. So if you can, in your project, while you're working on your project, you need to make sure that your leather still has the right amount of water in it, and that does take some experimentation, but you'll quickly see what the right amount of moisture is. First thing I'm going to do is take a little scrap piece of leather, rub some jeweler's rouge into it, and I'm going to make my swivel knife blade nice and polished. That's essential. You cannot do good decorative cuts, or even any cutting with a swivel knife, unless your knife blade is polished. It's not critical that it be razor sharp. I mean, it's nice if it's sharp, but it needs to be polished. So strop it, and you can see it turns the jeweler's rouge on this piece of leather black. That's because it's removing metal. Okay, now decorative cuts. This is how it's supposed to work. Now, that's really simple. One of the big tricks with decorative cuts is to keep them simple. As your skill improves, you can go ahead and complicate your cuts a little bit, and it doesn't take very long to really get pretty good with this little swivel knife. But there's a couple of things that you absolutely have to remember. First of all, it is mandatory, like I said, that that swivel knife be sharp. Now, in case you haven't figured it out yet, I'll tell you again. Your swivel knife has to be sharp. You probably get the idea. Sharpness is not an option here. It's got to be polished. Polished. Polished so that it's slick and slides through the leather. Okay, moisture content. You'll get the hang of that. Now, the trick about these decorative cuts is this. I'm going to make a couple of lines here with the swivel knife that are not related to these cuts, but you'll see what I'm talking about. Do you notice how all the cuts come down towards the point of that upside down triangle? That's what decorative cuts have to do. Now, if you have a Western floral pattern, then you have to decide where you want those cuts to come down to. For instance, we'll take a little, just a little bit of a freehand pattern here.
Yeah, look, I made one. See? Yeah. Brandon, see? Well, there you go. You can combine it right there. Oh, this is so nice. That's awesome.
Now, this is not, again, not complicated. That's just a simple little leaf and a scroll. What we want are decorative cuts that flow with that pattern. I'll show you a right way and a wrong way. Now, as we go about this, when you start a decorative cut, normally you want your knife blade to be crosswise in front of you. Maybe not quite perfectly crosswise, but kind of sort of crossways in front of you, not facing you vertically. You want it horizontally in front of you. The reason for that is when you make a decorative cut, you need to turn the swivel knife blade almost immediately. That's what gives us the cuts like we made over here. That blade was turned immediately. So we're going to put some little cuts in here and just watch. I'm starting that blade. You can see I push down, turn it, pull it towards me, and ease off the pressure. This one, I'm going to have just, this one's going to not be so horizontal. It's going to face me a little bit, and I'm going to turn it, follow the swivel cut. There's the two cuts that I just did. Now, notice the ends of the cut, they all point in the same direction. They point down to here. That's really important when you're making decorative cuts. They all need to point towards the same place. I'm going to make a few more. You'll start to see how this works. Decorative cuts don't have to be long and fancy. Starting with it crosswise in front of me, turning it around, digging it in, picking up the pressure, easing off several times. Now, look at the cuts in those leaves. They all have one thing in common. They come down to that point in your pattern. Whatever pattern that you're making, that's what you need to do. Ensure that those cuts come down to that focal point. And once you, and by the way, I got to tell you, this is tons easier on a good piece of leather than it is on a piece of leather that's not so good. I don't want this to sound like a big sales pitch, and maybe it does. But if you have never carved on leather such as Herman oak or perhaps Wickett and Craig, you really can't appreciate the difference in the way your swivel knife works. Now I'm going to go a little further. Just see what happens. And by the way, there's no rules when it comes to making decorative cuts other than the fact that they should flow and they should all come down to that point like we talked about. We're just making some very, very small cuts. Now some people would perhaps use an angle blade to make decorative cuts. I don't do that. I use a flat one. The reason I use a flat blade is because I'm lazy. It has, count them, 1, 2 corners. So when one corner gets dull, you turn around and you use the other one. Now you're still going to have to sharpen this thing every few minutes, so don't hesitate. And by the way, this is one of the things that will enable you to tell the difference between a really good piece of leather and a piece of leather that's not so good. If you've got your knife sharp and your knife kind of does this number, then you know that leather is just not the best leather that it could be. So, good piece of leather helps incredibly. And if you make a mistake, you can probably fix it. That's a good thing. Now look at all the happy little cuts. They're just little, they're small, they're simple. That's what you want to keep in mind when you're making decorative cuts. Keep them small, simple, and above all, ease off the pressure when the cut comes to an end. Gradually ease it off. Don't just stop. Here's what it looks like when you make a cut and all of a sudden you just stop. Look at this. What a difference between that and this. Look how nice that is. This one flows, this one just stops dead. I'm going to show you what happens when you don't keep those cuts coming down to a focal point. We're going to take that nice looking cut. You see, that's what happens right there to a lot of folks. They're making those swivel cuts and they forget to bring them all down to a point. And this is true on any floral carving pattern that you do. Now if you're working on an oak leaf, all those cuts go towards the center of the leaf. Any kind of a leaf, cuts go towards the center of the leaf. Now there's times, like I said, when you make a mistake, and you could probably fix things like this, but you have to fix them in such a way believe me, sometimes it's a little easier to do them right in the first place than it is to fix something. Now, I don't know how much fixing that is. You can decide. But it's at least better. There's a ton of exercises that you can do with a swivel knife to teach yourself to make decorative cuts. You can read books. You can get good leather. You can keep your knife sharp. But the biggest thing is to keep those cuts coming down in a focal point. Once you have a Western floral pattern on your leather, you can do so many things just by keeping that knife sharp. Shortcuts. Make your cuts simple. You can add to your design for days and days and days. Little accents make big differences. So there you go. Keep your swivel knife sharp. Keep it polished regularly. Jeweler's Rouge costs a couple bucks. You can get enough for that much money to last your lifetime probably. Now if you drop the dumb knife, then you're going to have to take that nick out, and so you'll need a stone or whatever, but you can repolish it. When you make a decorative cut, start with firm pressure and then ease up as you slowly pull it out of the leather as you glide it right back towards yourself. Keep the cuts coming down to a focal point, and that applies to inside of flowers, leaves, and everything. Practice with some border cuts. Decorative cuts don't have to be restricted to the inside of a pattern. Look at the outside. You can do all kinds of neat stuff. So there's a couple tips and hints. Thanks.